Everyone. If you like a title, the title is David in the Valley of Three Challenges. David and the Valley of Three Challenges. I'm sure in the days and weeks leading up to the Passover that we have probably run into many challenges, things that we have seen in ourselves, in our self-examination, things that we maybe didn't see in ourselves but now do. Things that we may have been able to overcome quite handily while others may seem almost impossible to overcome. And so what I would like to talk about today is to give you a little different take on the story of David and Goliath, and to discuss three challenges that David faced in the valley of Elah and how he overcame them. And then to see how we can face and overcome those same kinds of challenges in our lives today. So if you would begin turning with me then to 1 Samuel 17. 1 Samuel 17, verse 26. And I'm sure most of us are familiar with this story. And my electronic speech minder here just went crazy, so hang on just a second. Well, it's still working. But I'm sure all of you are very familiar with the story. David's three brothers had gone to fight with Saul, and they were at the Valley of Elah. And at a certain point, Jesse, Dad, said to David, his youngest, he said, put together some food for your brothers and for the army and run it up there. So essentially, that is what happened. David and his food and supplies arrived, and he left them with the keeper and immediately ran up to his brothers. This is his family. See how things are going. Give greetings. Let them know how stuff is going at home. And so he arrived, and he gets up there, and he gets there in time for something very interesting to happen, because what had been going on for the past 40 days is that Goliath, the Philistine champion, had been issuing a challenge. So every day for 40 days, he had been stepping out in front of his army and challenging the Israelite army and defying the living God. And so when David arrives, that is what is going on. I think I'm going to have to go to plan B here. No, it's the speech part. The Bible's just fine. If only it were in the Bible. It's just way smaller now. Stand by, almost there. Okay, so now let's notice verse 26. I guess I got to be in 1 Samuel. All right. Then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? So what you find here is David is clearly incensed by what he hears. But it's also clear where his mind, where his heart is. He is boldly standing up for God. He is answering that question that you find in Isaiah where God says, "Whom shall I send? Who will go for me? Go forward for me?" Well, that's David, because he's standing up for something that should have been done by Saul and the army of Israel for the past 40 days. But that has not been happening. And that included David's 3 eldest brothers. And if you remember, the oldest one, Eliab, was the one who, when he brought him out, Samuel said, "Oh, this has got to be the king." Apparently not. God knew his heart. Move on down to verse 28 here. It says, "Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David, and he said, 'Why did you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle.'" It's easy to see where Eliab's heart and mind are as well, because they're clearly not on God. And did you notice when Eliab became angry? Look at the tenor of his questions here. He's talking about David coming out to see the battle. Well, he didn't say anything to him when he came to greet him, did he? He waits until he hears David talking to the other men and hears him, quote unquote, stirring up trouble. And that's not what he's doing. He's standing up for God. Plus, he's questioning and criticizing David's responsibility and maturity in a pretty condescending manner, as well as calling him prideful. So all in all, Eliab seems to be trying very hard to humiliate David and to provoke an angry response. And if you notice David's response in verses 29 to 30, David says, "What have I done now? Is there not a cause?" And then he turned from him toward another and said the same thing, and those people answered him as the first ones, trying to find out what's going to be done for the man who kills this Philistine. David did not rise to the bait that his brother planted. He answered Eliab's questions with direct questions of his own, and the second of which points directly back to God. Is there not a cause? And then he simply moved on to other people and ignored any further provocative attempts. David deflected Eliab's attempt to draw him into an argument and put the focus on himself, instead of God, who was being maligned and ignored. David kept that focus on God. So let's move on to the second challenge then. Drop down, if you would, to verse 33. And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth, and he a man of war from his youth." This is right after David tells Saul, he says, that none should fear. Because, believe me, there had been a lot of fear and dismay going on up to this point. That none should fear as David would fight the Philistine. Notice once again they are attempting to dissuade David. This time, though, instead of criticism, they are trying to insert doubt. Notice verses 34 through 37. But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it, and I struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth, and when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God." Moreover, David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." You see how David combats this. In the first challenge, David is dealing with a person. He's not rude, but he's direct, and he does not encourage further discussion. In this second challenge, he is very respectful. Your servant. Towards his, I guess what you would call his king, his government, his employer, as it were, but responds directly to the doubt-inducing statement with a faith lesson of his own. He then tries on Saul's armor, decides against it, and he heads down into the valley with a lot of faith and soon to be a handful of stones. So after picking out those stones for his sling, David heads for his greatest challenge. Verse 42 through 44. And so when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good-looking. And so the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog, that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, he says, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." Goliath's approach here is very interesting. The very fact that David is a young man, and he's not wearing any armor, he's not carrying any sword, doesn't have a shield, just his sling and his staff. And apparently this was enough to make Goliath angry, and he despised David. And he then angrily accosts David with that statement, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" I mean, it's a very haughty and arrogant manner that Goliath takes, as if David were so far beneath him that he's almost not noticeable. He then begins to curse at David, probably using any and every possible expletive that he could possibly think of at that time to further demean David. And then he goes on with a very explicit death threat that was as disrespectful and demeaning as he could make it. You know, at that time, warriors preferred to be burned or at least buried upon death, not left for the animals to pick apart and clean up. So what is David's response to all this? Notice verse 45. David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword, a spear, and a shield, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." David is all in, isn't he? He is 100% committed, convicted. There's even a hint of that righteous anger that we saw earlier. I mean, God inspired David to make clear the kind of battle that was being fought that day. Yes, David brought rocks to a sword fight, as you may have heard in that contemporary Christian song. But what did Goliath do? He brought a sword and a spear to fight spiritual warfare? There was never even a chance. God inspired David to share with Goliath and the Philistine army what their end would be and why, so that all the world would know that there was a God in Israel. And for Israel, his people, the most important lesson, that the battle belongs to the Lord. So David faced the greatest challenge in his life to that point. A giant, if you will, obstacle directly in his path, which he overcame with steadfast faith, drawing on examples of God's intervention in his life on other occasions. Saul's armor, his sling, the stones in the brook, and his staff. But he acted without hesitation. He ran towards his opponent without fear. That is how David overcame the greatest challenges of his life to that point. So then how can we take these things and apply them in our own lives? Well, the first thing to remember is probably one of the last things said. The battle belongs to God. That's who it belongs to. It's not ours. It's his. And in all of these three challenges, Christ does in the New Testament, points everything right back to God. Is there not a cause? Defying God. God helped me fight those beasts in the wilderness. God will take care of you and your army. Everything goes back to God for David. David resists being drawn into self-focused and destructive conversations. He answered those questions with questions of his own, and then he pointedly moved on. When facing King Saul, his government, or his employer, as it were, he was very respectful, and he responded to the subtle doubt with faith. But he was still willing to consider any offered help. When facing his giant problem, he used the tools that worked for him. And he didn't hesitate. He didn't allow fear to enter the equation. He put the focus squarely on God. And that is how David dealt with his 3 challenges in the valley of Elah. And it's also how we can deal with challenges that we face both now and into the future. Because just because we've dealt with most of the giants now coming into Passover and the days of unleavened bread, you don't think there's more of them lining up throughout the rest of the next year? We need to be ready. Ready for how we can deal with those challenges that we face both now and into that future. So now as we move into the offertory portion of this message, if you would, if any of you need envelopes, please raise your hands so that the ushers can get them to you. I'd like to continue on with some thoughts on David. I mentioned earlier that he was 100% committed and convicted in faith to God and doing what was right in God's eyes. David had a right attitude. Mr. Vincent, in a sermon here several weeks ago, showed us how very important that is, having a right attitude. That in 1 Corinthians 11:27, where we are told to examine ourselves to see if we are taking that cup or eating that bread in an unworthy manner, that is not talking about whether or not we're worthy, because we're not. It's talking about the attitude in which we come. And so what is our attitude in giving? No matter how much we're able to give, is it with that humility? Is it with joy? No matter how much we're able to give, is it with that humility and joy? Turn with me, if you would, to Mark 12, verse 42. Mark 12, verse 42. We'll read through verse 44. Familiar territory. Then one poor widow came and threw in 2 mites, which make a quadrans, a very small amount. And so he called his disciples to himself, Christ did, and he said to them, Surely I say unto you that this poor widow has put in more than all those who have given to the treasury. For they all put in out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, put in all that she had, her whole livelihood. This lady had a right attitude, just like David. She gave everything she had to give. Like David, she was all in, 100% committed. For one final scripture, if you would, turn to Matthew 19, verse 22. Speaking of the rich young ruler, who had a lot of things going for him, except for one. But when the young man heard that saying, he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. He was unable to give them all away. That young man, he lived righteously. Clearly, he was raised that way and continued that way. But he didn't always think that way. There was no joy here when he was given the chance to share. He was not all in. He was not 100% committed. He had things of his own. And he didn't have that right attitude. So, brethren, think about where we are and what lies ahead. Think about what is our attitude. Will we go away sorrowful, or will we live with joy? So we'll be collecting an offering at this time. We're going to have offertory music.